The memory lived in Elena Ashford like a wound that never fully closed. It came to her in quiet moments, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the gentle rustle of leaves that sounded almost like her father's voice. She was 8 years old in the memory, sitting cross-legged on the dirt floor of a military tent, while the sounds of an army preparing for war drifted through the canvas walls. Her small hands rested on her knees as she watched her father's weathered fingers sort through bundles of dried herbs with the same precision he showed when cleaning his weapons. Captain Marcus Ashford had the kind of face that told stories without words. A scar curved along his left cheekbone where an enemy blade had come too close. Deep lines bracketed his mouth from years of giving orders in harsh conditions. His eyes, the same deep brown as Elena's own, held the distant look of a man who had seen too much death and somehow kept walking forward anyway. But when those eyes turned to his daughter, they softened into something almost tender. The lamplight cast dancing shadows across his scarred face as he held up a sprig of purple flowers. Their delicate petals seemed harmless enough, even beautiful in the warm glow, but Elena had learned that beauty in her father's world often concealed danger. "Remember this one well, little wolf." His voice carried the roughness of too many battlefield commands, too many knights shouting over the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. But it softened whenever he spoke to her, becoming something gentler, something that belonged to a different man than the warrior her pack feared and respected. This is wolfsbane. In the wrong hands it kills. In the right hands it heals. The difference is knowledge. The difference is dosage. The difference is intention. He paused, making sure she was truly listening. Elena straightened her spine and focused with all the intensity her young mind could muster. Her father never wasted words. Every lesson he gave her was a gift, a piece of himself that he was entrusting to her keeping. Elena reached out to touch the plant, and her father gently guided her fingers to the stem rather than the petals. The texture was rough beneath her fingertips, the leaves slightly fuzzy in the way of many poisonous plants. She inhaled its bitter scent, committing it to memory alongside all the other lessons he had given her over the years. Lessons about plants that could close wounds and plants that could open them. Lessons about reading the wind to sense approaching danger. Lessons about tracking movement through underbrush by the bent of grass and the displacement of soil. Lessons that no other Omega child in Wintervale Pack received, because no other Omega child had a father who believed his daughter deserved to know how to survive. The other adults in the pack whispered about it sometimes. Elena had heard them when they thought she was not listening. Strange, they said. Inappropriate. What use does an Omega have for knowledge of battlefield medicine? What good will it do her to know how soldiers fight? She should be learning to keep a home, to raise pups, to please a mate. Marcus Ashford never seemed to hear these whispers, or if he did, he simply did not care. "Why do you teach me these things, Papa?" She asked the question that had lingered in her young mind for months, the question she had been afraid to voice for fear that voicing it might make him stop. The other girls learn needlework and cooking. Their fathers do not show them how soldiers fight. Marcus Ashford set down the wolfsbane and lifted his daughter onto his knee. She went willingly, settling against his chest the way she had done since she was old enough to sit up on her own. Through the tent's opening, they could see the distant glow of campfires where the king's army prepared for what everyone knew would be the final battle against the Eastern Territory. Thousands of wolves gathered under one banner, sharpening weapons and checking armor, and saying silent prayers to gods who may or may not be listening. Tomorrow, her father would ride out with the Alpha King's personal guard, 12 wolves bound by blood oath to protect their sovereign with their lives. Tomorrow, everything might change. Because you are my daughter. His voice held a fierce pride that made Elena's small chest swell with emotions she did not have words for yet. Because being an Omega does not mean being helpless. Because knowledge is the weapon that no one can take from you. Because one day when I am not there to protect you, you will protect yourself. He held her tighter, and Elena felt the warmth of him seeping into her bones. Her father always ran hot, a trait common to warriors who spent their lives burning through energy in training and battle. She loved that warmth. It made her feel safe in ways nothing else could. The world is not kind to wolves who cannot defend themselves, little one. His voice dropped lower, taking on the tone he used when he wanted her to truly understand something important, especially not to Omegas. There are those who see your nature as weakness, as something to be exploited. I will not always be there to shield you from them. So I give you the only shield I can. Knowledge, skill, the understanding that your worth is not determined by anyone else's opinion of you. Elena did not understand then, not fully. She could not comprehend that her father already sensed what was coming, that he had looked into the eyes of war too many times not to recognize when death was circling close, that every lesson he crammed into their limited time together was a desperate attempt to armor his child against a future he would not live to see. "Papa, will you come back?" The question hung between them like morning mist, delicate and impossible to grasp. Elena felt her father's arms tighten around her. She felt the tremor that ran through his body, the one he tried so hard to hide but could not quite suppress. She was young, but she was not blind. She saw the way the other soldiers looked at the Eastern Territory's fortifications. She heard the whispered estimates of casualties. She understood, in the wordless way children sometimes understand, that her father was preparing to do something dangerous. "I will always be with you, little wolf." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his lips warm against her hair. "In everything I have taught you, in the strength you carry inside, even if you cannot see me, I will be watching, and I will be proud." He pulled back and looked into her eyes, and Elena saw something there that she would not understand until years later. It was goodbye. He was saying goodbye. That was the last time Elena saw her father alive. The battle was 3 days later. The victory was absolute. The Eastern Territory surrendered, and the Blood Moon Treaty was signed in the ashes of their defeat. Peace came to the territories for the first time in living memory. And Captain Marcus Ashford came home in a box draped with the royal standard. The news reached Wintervale Pack at sunset, carried by Commander Silas himself. He was a grizzled warrior whose eyes held the weight of 2 centuries of service, a male who had stood beside kings and watched civilizations rise and fall. He walked through the Pack's central square with the measured steps of someone who had delivered this kind of news too many times before, and his gaze found young Elena where she sat on the porch of her family's cottage, waiting for a father who would never return. The Alpha King's personal guard had been ambushed in a mountain pass during the final assault on the eastern stronghold. A traitor within the eastern ranks had fed them false information about an undefended route. What they found instead was an army waiting in the cliffs above, arrows and boulders and death raining down from every direction. 11 of the 12 brothers in arms had fallen. Only Silas himself had survived, dragging his wounded body through miles of hostile territory to bring word of what had happened. Captain Marcus Ashford had died throwing himself between a poisoned arrow and his king. The arrow had been meant for Cal Ironwood's heart. Marcus had seen it coming when no one else did, had moved without hesitation to intercept it, had taken the killing blow in his king's place. His sacrifice had bought precious seconds that allowed Kael to rally his forces and turn the ambush into a victory. They called her father a hero. They gave her a medal that she could not eat and a pension that barely covered the cost of a roof over her head. They spoke beautiful words at his funeral about duty and honor and the ultimate sacrifice. The Alpha King himself sent a letter expressing his gratitude and sorrow, though Elena was too young and too grief-stricken to read it at the time. And then they left her alone. An 8-year-old Omega with no mother, no father, no siblings, no extended family who wanted the burden of raising a child. The Pack took her on because they had to, because leaving her to die would have been a stain on their honor. But taking her in and wanting her were 2 very different things. 16 years passed like seasons turning, each one wearing away another layer of the life Elena had once imagined for herself. She grew from a grieving child into a quiet young woman who kept her father's lessons locked inside her heart like secret treasures. The other children had stopped playing with her after her father died, sensing the way the adults pulled away and mimicking what they saw. She learned to make herself small, to avoid drawing attention, to accept the pitying glances and whispered comments about the poor orphan of the fallen captain. She learned to survive. Her father's cottage became her sanctuary, a small structure at the edge of Pack territory where she could tend her herb garden and practice her healing arts without interference. The pension paid for basic supplies. Odd jobs earned her enough for extras. She asked nothing of the pack and gave them no reason to notice her. Some days the loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She would lie awake at night and wonder if this was all her life would ever be. An existence on the margins. A half-life of survival without connection. And then Declan Frost noticed her. He was the beta's son, handsome in a conventional way, with kind eyes the color of autumn leaves and a gentle manner that set him apart from the rougher males of the pack. Where others postured and competed and tried to establish dominance through aggression, Declan moved through the world with a quiet confidence that needed no proof. He was not the strongest wolf in Wintervale, nor the fastest, nor the most ambitious. But he was good, genuinely, truly good, in a way that Elena had almost forgotten existed. He saw Elena one autumn morning as she tended her small herb garden, her hands deep in the soil as she transplanted seedlings of feverfew and chamomile. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and found him standing at her garden gate, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Something in that expression shifted when their eyes met. Something like recognition, though they had never truly spoken beyond passing greetings. "You are Captain Ashford's daughter." It was not a question. "Your father served with my uncle in the King's Guard. He spoke of your family often." Elena did not know how to respond. No one spoke of her father anymore. It was as if he had been erased from pack memory, his sacrifice already fading into history. To hear his name spoken aloud with respect rather than pity made her throat tight with emotions she had suppressed for years. That first conversation lasted nearly an hour. Declan asked about her garden, about her knowledge of herbs, about the life she had built in the years since her father's death. He listened with genuine interest, not the polite detachment she had come to expect from others. He laughed at her dry observations about pack politics. He shared stories about his own family, his hopes for the future, his quiet frustrations with the expectations placed upon the beta's son. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. For 2 years, Declan courted her properly. He brought small gifts that showed he paid attention to the things she mentioned in passing. A rare seed for her garden, a book of herbal remedies from a distant territory, a warm cloak for the winter months that fit her perfectly because he had secretly measured one of her old ones. He made no demands, pushed no boundaries, offered no false promises of passionate love. What he offered instead was something Elena had not dared to hope for since her father's death. Belonging, a place in the pack hierarchy, protection, a future. When he asked her to be his mate, Elena said yes without hesitation. She did not love him the way the old stories described, with fire and desperation and souls recognizing each other across crowded rooms. The mate bond did not form between them, but that was not unusual. True mate bonds were rare, the stuff of legends and wishful thinking. Most wolves built their bonds through choice and commitment, through years of shared experience that wove 2 lives into one. Elena cared for Declan. She trusted him, she respected him, and she was so tired of being alone. The ceremony was set for the first full moon of spring. The day arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed like an omen of good things to come. The sky was clear, the temperature mild, the air sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. Elena woke before dawn and spent hours preparing, bathing with rose-scented oils, dressing in the ceremonial white gown that had been her mother's, arranging her dark hair in the traditional style for omega bonding ceremonies. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. For the first time in 16 years, she looked like someone with a future. Elena stood in the center of Wintervale Pack's ceremonial grounds as the moon rose fat and silver above the tree line. 200 pack members surrounded her in concentric circles, their faces illuminated by torchlight, their eyes fixed on the small raised platform where her future would be decided. The white dress whispered against her skin with every breath she took. The weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had never felt more exposed, never felt more visible. For 16 years, she had perfected the art of going unnoticed. Now every eye in the pack was on her. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited for Declan to approach. She told herself it was anticipation, not fear. She reminded herself that this was what she wanted, what she had dreamed of during all those lonely nights in her father's cottage. A home, a family, a mate who would stand beside her through whatever life brought, an end to the loneliness that had been her constant companion since childhood. Declan emerged from the crowd, and Elena's heart stuttered in her chest. He looked wrong. His face was pale beneath his tan, the healthy color drained away until he looked almost ill. His jaw was clenched so tight that the muscles stood out in sharp relief. His eyes kept darting to something or someone at the edge of the gathering, then snapping back to Elena with an expression she could not read. His hands were shaking worse than hers, trembling at his sides as if he were fighting against invisible restraints. Something cold coiled in Elena's stomach, something that whispered warnings she did not want to hear. He stopped 3 feet away from her, close enough for the ceremony but too far for comfort. Too far for the intimacy that should have been building between them in this moment. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Elena watched him struggle with words that seemed to stick in his throat like broken glass. And then she noticed the stranger. At the very edge of the torchlight, half hidden in the shadow of a massive oak tree, stood a figure she did not recognize. A male in a dark, hooded cloak, his face obscured except for his eyes. Those eyes caught the firelight and reflected it back red, like embers burning in the darkness. Like coals that had been banked but not extinguished. He was watching Declan with an intensity that felt like a physical presence, a pressure against Elena's skin that made her want to step back, even though she could not have said why. Declan's gaze flicked to that figure once more. Elena saw something pass between them, some silent communication that she was not meant to witness. When Declan looked back at her, something in his expression had shattered. Whatever resolve he had been clinging to, whatever hope he had been harboring, it was gone. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already lost. "I cannot accept you as my mate." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Ripples of shock spread through the gathered pack. Elena heard gasps, murmurs, the sharp intake of breath from the beta's wife standing behind her son. She heard the rustle of 200 bodies leaning forward, straining to understand what was happening, to witness the disaster unfolding before them. But Elena heard nothing after those first 6 words. Her world had compressed to the space between heartbeats, to the impossible reality of what was happening. Time slowed, stopped, stretched into something elastic and terrible. The bond I thought we shared, the future I imagined, it is not what I need. His voice cracked on the last word, breaking like ice under too much weight. You deserve someone who can love you the way you deserve. I am not that wolf. I am sorry, Elena. I am so sorry. She felt the rejection hit her like a physical blow, like a fist driven into her solar plexus with brutal precision. Her omega nature, the deep instinctual part of her that craved acceptance and belonging above all else, recoiled from the public refusal with a violence that buckled her knees. The white dress that had felt like hope now felt like a shroud, the fabric suddenly heavy and suffocating. She collapsed onto the ceremonial platform, her legs simply refusing to hold her weight any longer. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Rejection sickness crashed through her walls in waves of agony, her wolf howling inside her chest at the severing of a bond that had never quite formed but had come close enough to leave ragged edges. It felt like being torn apart from the inside, like something essential was being ripped out of her by the roots. She was dimly aware of pack healers rushing forward, their voices rising in alarm. Hands lifted her from the cold ground. Someone pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. Someone else called for water, for blankets, for the healer who specialized in omega trauma. But through the haze of physical torment, one image burned itself into her memory with perfect clarity. Declan turning away from her, his shoulders hunched with what might have been shame or fear or grief. And beyond him, at the edge of the torchlight, the stranger in the dark cloak nodding once with clear satisfaction before melting into the shadows like smoke dispersing on the wind. That nod haunted her through 2 weeks of fever and delirium. It stalked her through the pitying visits from pack members who did not know what to say. It whispered to her in the quiet moments between waves of pain, suggesting that there was more to her rejection than a simple change of heart. Declan had not wanted to reject her. Something or someone had forced his hand. But by the time Elena was strong enough to investigate, Declan had left Wintervale Pack on an extended journey to visit distant relatives. The stranger in the dark cloak had vanished like smoke, and the pack had moved on, already forgetting the Omega girl who had been publicly humiliated, already weaving her rejection into the tapestry of gossip and speculation that bound small communities together. Elena made her decision on a cold morning 3 weeks after the ceremony that never was. She stood in the cottage that had been her home since childhood, looking at the meager possessions that represented her entire life. A trunk of clothes, her father's old military compass, the dried herbs she had cultivated and preserved over the years, the medal they had given her when her father died. She packed what she could carry and left the rest behind. Becoming a rogue was supposed to be a death sentence for an Omega. Without pack protection, without territory, without the social bonds that gave her kind stability and purpose, she should have withered away within months. The elders had said as much when word spread of her departure. "Poor thing," they whispered. "She will not last the summer." But Elena was her father's daughter, and Marcus Ashford had not raised a daughter who would lie down and die just because the world expected her to. 3 months she traveled through neutral territories, taking work wherever she could find it. She cleaned kitchens and way stations. She mended clothes for traveling merchants. She tended gardens for elderly wolves too frail to do it themselves. And whenever she encountered someone sick or wounded, she offered her knowledge of herbs and healing, the legacy her father had left her. Word began to spread through the rogue networks. There was an Omega healer wandering the neutral zones. She asked for nothing but fair payment and showed no judgment about pack affiliations or past mistakes. She had saved a young wolf from infection that should have killed him. She had eased the passing of an elder who had been suffering for months. She had pulled a gamma back from the edge of death after a bar fight went wrong. They called her the Wandering Healer. They did not know her name, and she did not offer it. But they remembered her hands, steady and sure as she worked. They remembered her eyes, watchful and knowing as she diagnosed ailments that had baffled pack healers. They remembered her voice, calm and confident, as she gave instructions that turned out to be exactly right. Elena did not think of herself as remarkable. She was simply doing what her father had taught her. Surviving, helping where she could, building something that resembled a life from the wreckage of her old one. But she could not escape the dreams. Every night, her Omega nature reached out for a bond that no longer existed. Every night, she woke with tears on her cheeks and a hollow ache in her chest where something vital had been torn away. The rejection sickness had passed, but its shadow lingered, coloring her days with a loneliness she could not shake. She told herself she was fine. She told herself she did not need a mate or a pack or any of the things she had once wanted so desperately. She built walls around her heart, higher and thicker with each passing week, until she almost believed that nothing could hurt her again. And then she met him. The way station was busier than usual when Elena arrived that autumn evening. Traveling wolves filled the common room, their conversations creating a buzz of noise that pressed against her heightened senses. She had been hired for a week to help in the kitchens, and she welcomed the work even if the crowds made her uneasy. She was carrying a tray of dirty dishes from the common room to the kitchen when the front door opened and silence fell like a hammer. Elena looked up. The male standing in the doorway was unlike anyone she had ever seen. Tall and powerfully built, he carried himself with the unconscious authority of someone who had never needed to prove his dominance. His hair was black as a raven's wing, but silver streaked at his temples, speaking of an age that his unlined face seemed to contradict. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, old and faded but still visible. A permanent reminder of violence survived. But it was his eyes that stopped Elena's breath. Gray as storm clouds, deep as the ocean, carrying the weight of centuries in their depths. Those eyes swept the room with practiced assessment, cataloging threats and exits in every soul present. And then they found her. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. Elena stood frozen with her tray of dirty dishes, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stare at the stranger who had just walked in and somehow changed everything. She felt something stir inside her, something that had been dormant since Declan's rejection, perhaps longer. Her Omega nature, beaten down and locked away, suddenly surged toward the surface with a desperation that terrified her. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to submit, to approach, to bare her throat to this male whose very presence made her feel small and safe and seen all at once. She did not know him. She had never laid eyes on him before this moment, and yet some ancient part of her recognized him with absolute certainty. Mate? The word blazed through her mind like wildfire, and Elena reacted the only way she could. She turned and fled to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands shaking so badly that dishes rattled on her tray. No, 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 no. This was impossible. The mate bond did not work like this. It did not form between strangers who had never exchanged a word. It certainly did not form between a rejected rogue Omega and whatever impossibly powerful Alpha had just walked into a roadside way station. She was hallucinating. She was still sick from the rejection. She was so starved for connection that her Omega nature had latched onto the first dominant male to cross her path. That was all this was. That had to be all this was. Elena forced herself to focus on the dishes. She washed them with mechanical precision, scrubbing each plate until it gleamed, using the mundane task to anchor herself to reality. She did not look toward the common room. She did not listen for the stranger's voice among the murmur of conversation. She did not allow herself to wonder who he was or why he had looked at her with such intensity. She almost convinced herself she had imagined the whole thing. And then one of the other kitchen workers burst through the door, eyes wide with excitement. Did you see? Did you see who that is? The girl could barely contain herself. That is Cale Ironwood, the Alpha King himself. The king of the Northern Territories is in our way station. Elena's hands went still in the dishwater. The plate she was holding slipped from nerveless fingers and sank beneath the suds. Cale Ironwood. She knew that name. Every wolf in the territories knew that name. The Alpha King who had ruled for nearly 300 years. The warrior who had united the packs and forged the peace that had lasted half a century. The legendary commander who had led the final battle against the Eastern Territory. The king her father had died to save. The world tilted beneath Elena's feet. She gripped the edge of the wash basin to steady herself, her mind racing through implications she could not fully grasp. The Alpha King, her Omega nature had recognized the Alpha King as her mate. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She wanted to cry at the cruelty. Of all the wolves in all the territories, why would fate choose to torment her with this? She was nobody. Less than nobody. A rejected rogue Omega who washed dishes for coin and slept wherever she could find shelter. The very idea that she could be destined for the most powerful wolf alive was a joke too bitter to be funny. Elena stayed in the kitchen until long after the royal party retired to private rooms. She volunteered for extra shifts, for any task that would keep her hidden and busy. She avoided the common room, the corridors, anywhere she might accidentally encounter those storm gray eyes again. But she could not avoid her own thoughts. In the darkness of the small storage room where she slept, Elena lay awake and tried to make sense of what had happened. Her Omega nature had calmed somewhat with distance, but it remained restless, aware, reaching towards something she would not allow it to have. She felt incomplete in a way she had never felt before, not even after Declan's rejection. As if seeing Cale Ironwood had awakened a hunger she had not known existed. This is nothing, she told herself firmly. Your Omega nature responded to his dominance. He is the most powerful Alpha in existence. Any Omega would feel that pull. It means nothing. But she had been around powerful Alphas before. Her former Pax Alpha, visiting dignitaries, commanders who had served with her father. None of them had ever made her feel like this. None of them had made her want to fall to her knees and offer herself with a single glance. Sleep did not come that night. 2 days later, the royal party departed. Elena watched from the kitchen window as the Alpha King mounted his horse, his powerful frame moving with a warrior's grace. For just a moment, he paused and looked back at the way station. She could have sworn his gaze found her window, found her face pressed against the glass. Then he rode away, and Elena told herself she was relieved. She was wrong. The heat came without warning. Elena had been walking through the forest, heading toward the next settlement where a merchant had promised her work, when the first wave hit. It crashed over her with a violence that stole her breath and buckled her knees. Heat, real heat, the omega cycle she had experienced a dozen times before. But this was different. This was fire. This was madness. This was need so overwhelming that it bordered on pain. Her skin burned. Her blood sang. Every nerve ending in her body screamed for something she could not name, for someone she could not have. She stumbled off the path, desperate to find shelter before she lost herself completely. Through tear-blurred vision, she spotted an old cabin half hidden among the trees. Hunters had used it once, perhaps, before it was abandoned to the forest. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The windows were dark. It would have to do. Elena barely made it inside before the second wave hit. She collapsed on the dusty floor, her body convulsing with need, her mind fragmenting into desperate, incoherent pleas. This was not a normal heat. This was something triggered, something amplified, something that demanded satisfaction in ways she had never experienced. And as the third wave crashed over her, as her hands moved of their own accord, seeking relief that would not come, her traitorous mind conjured an image. Gray eyes like storm clouds, black hair silvering at the temples, a scar running from temple to jaw, power and dominance in ancient, weary strength. Kale. The name tore from her throat without permission. She did not want to think of him. She did not want to imagine his hands on her skin, his voice in her ear, his body covering hers. But her omega nature had recognized something that her conscious mind refused to accept, and now it would not let her forget. Please. She did not know who she was begging. The universe. The moon goddess. The empty cabin walls. Please, Alpha King. I need you. Choose me. Want me. The words spilled from her lips in an endless stream of desperate supplication. She hated herself for every syllable. She was better than this. Stronger than this. Her father had raised her to be self-sufficient, to need no one, to survive on her own merits. But her father had not prepared her for this. The heat lasted 3 days. 3 days of fire and need and shameful fantasies she could not control. 3 days of crying his name into the darkness, of imagining scenarios she had no business imagining, of surrendering completely to desires that terrified her. She did not know that she was not alone. She did not know that Kale Ironwood had ordered his most trusted wolves to follow her after their encounter at the way station. She did not know that reports of her location and condition had reached the Alpha King within hours of her entering that cabin. She did not know that he had abandoned his journey to the eastern summit and ridden through the night to reach her. She did not know that he stood less than a mile away, close enough to hear her calling his name, close enough to scent her heat on the wind, every instinct he possessed screaming at him to go to her. Kale Ironwood had lived for nearly 300 years. He had fought countless battles, made impossible decisions, carried the weight of his people on his shoulders through decades of war and decades more of uneasy peace. He had lost every wolf he had ever called brother except one. He had buried lovers and friends and enemies alike, watching the centuries pass and taking something from him with each turning of the year. He had long since given up hope of finding his true mate. The mate bond was rare enough for ordinary wolves. For a king who had outlived everyone he had ever loved, it seemed like a cruel joke to even consider. He had resigned himself to ruling alone, to dying alone, to leaving his kingdom to whatever heir the Blood Moon Treaty demanded. And then he had walked into a weigh station and locked eyes with a common Omega washing dishes. The mate bond had struck him like lightning. Instantaneous, undeniable, absolute. Every cell in his ancient body recognized her, claimed her, knew her with a certainty that transcended reason. His mate, his fated one, the other half of his soul. But she had fled from him. And when Silas had discreetly gathered information, Kale had learned the truth that made his heart crack along old fault lines. Elena Ashford, daughter of Captain Marcus Ashford. Marcus, who had served in Kale's personal guard for 50 years. Marcus, who had been a brother in all but blood. Marcus, who had thrown himself between Kyle and a poisoned arrow, giving his life so his king could live. Marcus, who had left behind a daughter that Kyle had never known existed. The irony was not lost on him. The universe had presented him with his true mate, and she was the child of a man who had died for him. A man whose sacrifice Kyle had honored with medals and ceremonies, while his daughter grew up alone, unprotected, eventually rejected and cast out to wander. He had failed Marcus. He had failed Elena without ever knowing she existed. And now she was in heat, alone in an abandoned cabin, calling his name with a desperation that matched his own. Go to her. His alpha nature raged against his control. She calls for you. She needs you. She is yours. But Kyle had not survived 3 centuries by giving in to instinct. He had learned through bitter experience the cost of acting without thought. And he knew with the part of his mind that remained rational that going to Elena now would be wrong. She did not know about the mate bond. She did not know he had been having her watched. From her perspective, he was a stranger she had glimpsed once at a way station, a king so far above her station that any connection between them was impossible. If he appeared at her cabin now while she was heat-maddled and unable to refuse, it would not be claiming. It would be taking. Cale Ironwood had done many things in his long life that he was not proud of. He had killed. He had conquered. He had ruled with an iron fist before learning that fear was a poor foundation for loyalty. But he had never, in 300 years, taken a woman who did not want him freely and clearly. He would not start with his mate. She is calling for you. Silas stood beside him in the forest, close enough to hear Elena's desperate pleas carried on the wind. Perhaps on some level she recognizes the bond. That changes nothing. Cale's voice was rough with the effort of control. I will not go to her like this. You may not be able to stop yourself. The old commander's voice held no judgment, only the honest assessment of a wolf who had known his king for 2 centuries. The mate bond does not care about honor or propriety. If you stay this close while she calls for you, your control will shatter. Cale knew Silas was right. He could feel his resolve weakening with every breath of Elena's scent, with every whispered cry of his name. His alpha nature was howling for release, demanding he claim what was his. Kale, her voice reached him again, broken and needing. Please, I need you. Cale turned away. Every step felt like walking through fire. Every step away from that cabin was a betrayal of everything his instincts screamed at him to do. But he took them anyway. Because Elena Ashford deserved better than a heat-fevered claiming. Because Marcus Ashford's daughter deserved to be courted properly, to be told the truth, to be given the choice that heat would have stolen from her. Because Cale Ironwood had waited 300 years for his mate, he could wait a few more days until she was ready to meet him as an equal. Post guards around the cabin, he ordered Silas, his voice barely recognizable. No one approaches her. No one touches her. And when her heat passes, inform me immediately. And you, my king? Silas looked at him with ancient eyes that had seen too much. I will wait. 3 days Cale waited. 3 days of reports that told him Elena was suffering but safe. 3 days of imagining her alone in that cabin, needing him, calling for him while he forced himself to stay away. It was the longest 3 days of his 300 years. And when word finally came that her heat had passed, that she had emerged from the cabin, weak but recovered, and was heading toward the western settlements, Cale gave the order he had been waiting to give. Find her a believable reason to encounter my party on the road. I want to see her. I want to speak to her. And this time I want her to know exactly who I am. The king was going to meet his queen. She just did not know it yet. The heat passed like a fever breaking, leaving Elena weak and wrung out and desperately grateful to be alone. She lay on the cabin floor for hours after the last wave subsided, staring at the dust motes dancing in the sunlight that filtered through cracks in the wooden walls. Her body ached in places she did not want to think about. Her throat was raw from crying out, from begging, from calling a name she had no business speaking. Shame settled over her like a burial shroud. She had spent 3 days lost in fantasies about the Alpha King, 3 days moaning his name into the darkness, 3 days imagining his hands on her body, his voice in her ear, his presence filling the empty spaces inside her that she had tried so hard to ignore. What was wrong with her? He was a king. She was less than nothing. The very idea that she could want him, need him, call for him like some desperate creature was humiliating beyond words. Her father had raised her to be strong, to be self-sufficient, to need no one. And here she was, reduced to a whimpering mess by a male she had seen for mere seconds. Elena forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she locked her knees and refused to fall. She had survived rejection. She had survived 3 months as a rogue. She would survive this too. She gathered her meager belongings and left the cabin without looking back. The forest path stretched before her, dappled with afternoon sunlight, leading toward the western settlements where she hoped to find work. One foot in front of the other. That was all survival required. One step, then another, until the shame faded and the memories dimmed and she could pretend that none of this had ever happened. She had been walking for perhaps 2 hours when she heard the thunder of hooves approaching from behind. Elena stepped off the path, pressing herself against a thick oak tree as the sound grew louder. Bandits sometimes roamed these neutral territories, preying on lone travelers. She reached for the small knife hidden in her boot, her father's lessons echoing in her mind. Find cover. Assess the threat. Never let them see your fear. But it was not bandits who emerged from around the bend in the road. The royal standard flew at the head of the column, a black wolf silhouetted against a silver moon. Armored soldiers rode in perfect formation, their discipline evident in every movement. And at the center of it all, mounted on a midnight black stallion that seemed too magnificent to be real, sat the Alpha King himself. Elena's heart stopped. Cale Ironwood looked different in the harsh light of day than he had in the shadowed doorway of the way station. Harder somehow, more real. The scar on his face stood out in sharp relief, a permanent reminder of violence survived. His gray eyes swept the road with the practiced assessment of a warrior, missing nothing, cataloging everything. Those eyes found her pressed against the tree, and the column slowed to a halt. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure, like hands pressing against her chest. Her Omega nature stirred despite her exhaustion, reaching toward him with a desperation that made her want to scream. No, she would not do this. She would not throw herself at a king's feet like some lovesick fool. Whatever her body thought it wanted, her mind knew better. She forced herself to step away from the tree and bow her head in the submissive gesture expected from an Omega encountering royalty. Perhaps he would simply ride past. Perhaps he would not even remember the servant girl from the way station. Perhaps this was just a coincidence, a chance encounter on a forest road that meant nothing. The creak of leather told her he was dismounting. The soft thud of boots on packed earth told her he was approaching. And the sudden spike in her pulse told her that she was in serious trouble. Are you well, Omega? His voice was deeper than she remembered, rougher around the edges. It sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. I am well, Alpha. Thank you for your concern. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, on his boots, on anything but his face. I merely traveled to the next settlement seeking work. Your scent indicates recent heat sickness. Elena flinched. Of course he could smell it on her. Every wolf within a mile could probably smell the lingering traces of her cycle, the weakness she could not hide no matter how hard she tried. Did you have adequate shelter? His voice softened slightly. Were you safe? Yes, Alpha. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She had been safe enough physically. Emotionally was another matter entirely. A pause stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid. Look at me. It was not a request. The Alpha command in his voice resonated through her bones, impossible to resist. Slowly, reluctantly, Elena raised her eyes to meet his. The impact nearly staggered her. Storm gray eyes looked into hers with an intensity that seemed to see straight through every wall she had built, every defense she had constructed, every lie she had told herself about being fine. He was beautiful in the way that mountains were beautiful, in the way that thunderstorms were beautiful. Vast and powerful and utterly beyond her reach. What is your name? Elena Ashford. Alpha. The words came out barely above a whisper. And where is your pack? Elena Ashford. I have none, Alpha. I am rogue. By choice or by circumstance? Elena felt something spark in her chest, a tiny flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished even in the face of such overwhelming power. Does it matter? She saw a surprise flicker across his face, followed by something that might have been approval. Most Omegas would not dare to speak so boldly to a king. Most Omegas would grovel and simper and say whatever they thought he wanted to hear. Elena was too tired for games, too worn down by weeks of hardship and the fresh humiliation of her heat. If he wanted to punish her for insolence, so be it. At least she would face him as herself, not as some cowering creature afraid of its own shadow. It matters, Kael said slowly, because if you are rogue by circumstance, perhaps that circumstance can be changed. I was rejected by my intended mate. Elena kept her voice flat, emotionless, as if she were recounting something that had happened to someone else. I chose to leave my former pack rather than remain as an object of pity. That is understandable and brave. Not many Omegas have the courage to walk away from everything they know. I had nothing left to lose. The words hung between them, raw and honest in a way that Elena had not intended. She saw something shift in Kael's expression, something that looked almost like pain. That is where you are wrong, he said quietly. You have yourself, your strength, your future. Those are not nothing. Elena stared at him, unable to formulate a response. No one had spoken to her like this since her father died. No one had looked at her as if she mattered, as if her existence had value beyond her status as a rejected Omega. Will you travel with us to the next settlement? Kael offered. The roads can be dangerous for those traveling alone. Your safety would be assured in our company. Every instinct Elena possessed screamed at her to refuse. To run. To put as much distance between herself and this male as possible before her traitorous heart did something unforgivable. But she was exhausted. Her body still ached from the heat. And the thought of walking for miles more on legs that could barely support her weight was almost more than she could bear. I would not wish to impose on your Majesty's generosity. You are not imposing, I am offering. Will you accept? A long moment passed. Elena felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, felt the certainty that whatever she chose in this moment would change the course of her life forever. Yes, Alpha, thank you. Relief flickered across Kael's face so quickly that Elena almost missed it. He gestured toward an ornate carriage near the center of the column, and one of his guards hurried to open the door. Elena climbed inside on shaking legs, sinking into velvet cushions that felt impossibly soft after months of sleeping on hard ground and harder floors. The carriage was luxurious in a way she had never experienced, with intricate carvings on the woodwork and curtains of deep blue silk framing the windows. Kael climbed in after her and settled onto the seat across from hers. The door closed. The carriage lurched into motion, and Elena found herself alone with the Alpha King in a space that suddenly felt far too small. She pressed herself into the corner, trying to maintain appropriate distance, trying not to be obvious about the way every cell in her body was straining toward him. The mate bond that her Omega nature insisted existed pulsed between them like a living thing, demanding acknowledgement she refused to give. You seem afraid of me. Kael's voice was gentle, but his eyes missed nothing. I am not afraid, Alpha. Merely cautious. I have learned that powerful wolves rarely offer help without expecting something in return. A fair assessment, but incorrect in this case. I want nothing from you except the opportunity to know you better. Elena studied him, searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding behind those words. She found nothing but steady sincerity and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Why? The question came out more sharply than she intended. Why what? Why do you care? Elena demanded, her caution finally giving way to frustration. I am nobody. A rejected rogue Omega you happen to encounter on the road. You are the Alpha King. You rule the Northern Territories. You have lived for 3 centuries and commanded armies and shaped the fate of nations. What possible interest could you have in someone like me? Kael was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Elena's breath catch. I have lived for nearly 300 years, he said slowly. I have ruled for 250 of them. I have fought wars and signed treaties and buried more friends than I can count. And in all that time, I have learned one truth that supersedes all others. The most valuable things in life are rarely the ones we expect. Power means nothing without purpose. Wealth means nothing without someone to share it with. And the wolves who matter most are often the ones the world has overlooked. He paused, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. I see you, Elena Ashford. I see your strength hiding behind your submission. I see your intelligence masking itself as compliance. I see a wolf who has been told her entire life that she has no value and who has somehow managed to survive despite believing it. That is why I care. That is why I want to know you better. Because wolves like you are rarer than you know. Elena felt tears prick her eyes and quickly looked away, blinking them back with fierce determination. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. The carriage continued its steady progress along the forest road, and the silence that fell between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two wolves who had said too much and too little all at once, who were still circling each other, still trying to understand what this encounter might mean. They traveled for several hours before the first sign of trouble appeared. Elena heard it before she saw it, a distant cry that might have been a bird, but carried the undertone of warning that any soldier's daughter would recognize. She sat up straighter, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife in her boot. Cale noticed immediately, his eyes sharpened, his body tensing with the coiled readiness of a predator sensing danger. You hear it too. It was not a question. Something is wrong, Elena said. That call, it was a scout's warning. Before Cale could respond, chaos erupted outside the carriage. The sounds of combat crashed over them like a wave. Steel rang against steel. Wolves snarled and howled. The carriage lurched violently as the horses screamed and reared. Stay here, Cale commanded, his hand already on the door. He was gone before Elena could protest, throwing himself into the battle with the ease of a wolf who had been fighting since before she was born. Through the window, she caught glimpses of the conflict. Rogues, at least 20 of them, had ambushed the column from the tree line. The Royal Guard was fighting back with disciplined precision, but the attackers had the advantage of surprise. Elena should have stayed in the carriage. She should have huddled on the velvet cushions and waited for the danger to pass. That was what Omegas were supposed to do. That was what everyone expected of her. But her father had not raised her to cower. She saw the rogue before anyone else did. A massive male with wild eyes and blood-stained claws, circling around the edge of the battle toward the carriage. His gaze was fixed on her through the window, and the hungry smile that spread across his face told her exactly what he intended. Elena's hand closed around her knife. Her other hand found the small pouch of ground pepper she kept in her medicine bag, a deterrent her father had taught her to always carry. The rogue reached the carriage door and wrenched it open, his claws reaching for her with predatory anticipation. He expected her to scream, to freeze, to be easy prey. He did not expect her to throw a handful of ground pepper directly into his eyes. The rogue howled, staggering backward as the burning powder blinded him. Elena did not hesitate. She lunged forward, her knife finding the vulnerable point at his wrist where the tendons connected. She had practiced this move 100 times on training dummies, had memorized the exact angle needed to sever the muscles that allowed the hand to grip. The rogue's claws went limp, his weapon clattered to the ground. Elena hooked her leg behind his knee and used his own momentum against him, sending him crashing to the ground. She followed him down, her arm wrapping around his throat in the submission hold her father had drilled into her muscle memory. The rogue thrashed and struggled, but Elena held firm. She was smaller than him, weaker in raw strength, but leverage and technique could overcome brute force when properly applied. She had learned that lesson well. She held the position until the rogue's struggles weakened, until his body went slack with unconsciousness rather than death. Only then did she look up. Cale stood 3 feet away, frozen in the act of rushing to her aid. His face was splattered with the blood of enemies he had cut down, his chest heaving from exertion, his eyes wide with an emotion Elena could not identify. Behind him, an older female warrior with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of a commanding officer had stopped mid-stride, her sword still raised, her expression one of complete shock. The battle was ending around them. The remaining rogues were fleeing into the forest or being subdued by the royal guard. But no one was paying attention to the retreat. Every eye was fixed on the Omega, who had just taken down a wolf twice her size using nothing but pepper and technique. The female warrior found her voice first. "What manner of Omega fights like a soldier?" Elena released her hold on the unconscious rogue and rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her worn traveling clothes with as much dignity as she could muster. "My father was Captain Marcus Ashford," she said simply. "He taught me to defend myself before he rode to war." The effect of her words was immediate and profound. The female warrior's eyes widened. Several of the nearby soldiers exchanged significant glances. And Kael, the Alpha King who had lived for 3 centuries and thought he had seen everything, looked as if he had been struck by lightning. "Ashford." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Marcus Ashford." "You knew him?" Elena asked. The pain that crossed Kael's face was raw and undisguised. "He was my brother in all but blood." The words fell between them like stones, heavy with implications Elena did not fully understand. She saw the female warrior glance at Kael with concern. She saw the old male who served as Kael's second, the one called Commander Silas, push through the gathered soldiers with an expression of dawning recognition. "My king," Silas said quietly, "we should make camp and tend to the wounded, and perhaps continue this conversation in private." Kael nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. There was something in his gaze that went beyond curiosity, beyond the interest he had shown earlier. This was something deeper, something that looked almost like guilt. "Yes," he said, "we will make camp here. And then, Elena Ashford, I believe we have much to discuss." The camp was established with military efficiency. Tents rose from the forest floor like mushrooms after rain. Fires were lit, perimeters were set, wounded were treated. Elena helped where she could, using her knowledge of herbs to supplement the royal healer supplies, earning surprised approval from wolves who had expected her to be useless. But through it all, she was aware of Kael watching her, aware of the conversation that waited, the revelations that hung in the air like smoke before a storm. When darkness fell and the camp settled into the quiet alertness of soldiers at rest, a guard appeared at Elena's small tent. "The king requests your presence." Elena followed him through the maze of tents to the largest pavilion at the center of camp. The royal standard flew above it, that black wolf on silver that had haunted her childhood memories of her father's departure. Inside, Kael sat alone. A single lamp cast shadows across his scarred face, making him look older than his appearance suggested. The weight of 3 centuries seemed to press down on his shoulders as he gestured for Elena to take the seat across from him. She sat, she waited, and finally Kael began to speak. "Your father was not merely a captain in my army," he said, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "He was one of the 12 wolves who swore blood oaths to protect me with their lives. We fought together for 200 years. We bled together. We buried our enemies together. They were my brothers, Elena. The closest thing to family I have ever known." Elena felt something shift in her chest. Her father had never spoken of his service in such personal terms. She had known he was part of the king's guard. She had not known what that truly meant. 50 years ago, Keiko continued, we rode to end the war with the Eastern Territory. We had intelligence about an undefended past that would allow us to strike at their stronghold. What we found instead was an ambush. A traitor had sold our route to the enemy. They were waiting for us in the cliffs above, and they rained death down upon us without mercy. His hands clenched on the arms of his chair, knuckles white with remembered rage. 11 of my brothers fell that day. 11 wolves who had stood beside me for centuries, who had saved my life more times than I could count. And your father, he was the last. He saw the arrow meant for my heart before I did. He moved without hesitation, put himself between me and death, took the poison that was meant to end my reign. Kael's voice broke on the last words. Elena saw moisture glistening in his eyes, saw the ancient grief that he had carried for half a century. He died in my arms, Elena. His last words were a command, not a request. Care for the kingdom, he said. Do not let our sacrifice be meaningless. I swore to him that I would honor that command. I have tried every day since to be worthy of what he gave. Elena did not know what she was feeling. Anger and grief and confusion swirled together in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her father had died for this male, had given his life so that Cahill Ironwood could continue ruling, had chosen his king over his daughter. And you did not know he had a child. Her voice came out flat. You did not know I existed. I did not. Cahill met her eyes without flinching. Marcus never spoke of family. I assumed he had none. I assumed that his dedication to his duty meant he had sacrificed personal connections as so many of us did. I did not learn of your existence until days ago, when I had you investigated after our encounter at the way station. Investigated. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. You have been watching me. I have had you protected, KL corrected gently. When the mate bond formed between us at the way station, I knew I needed to understand who you were before approaching you. What I learned, he paused, his expression twisting with self-recrimination. What I learned was that I had failed your father in the worst possible way. He died to save me, and I left his daughter to struggle alone for 16 years. I left you to be rejected and cast out and forced to survive without the protection that should have been yours by right. Elena sat in stunned silence. The mate bond. He was speaking of the mate bond as if it were real, as if the desperate pull she felt toward him was not just her omega nature responding to his dominance, but something more. You felt it too, she said slowly, at the way station. I felt it the moment our eyes met. Cale's voice was quiet but certain. The true mate bond forming between us with more force than I have ever experienced. You are my fated one, Elena. The other half of my soul that I had given up hope of ever finding. And you are the daughter of the brother I failed. Is that why you offered to help me? Elena demanded, anger finally breaking through her shock. Because of guilt. Because you feel you owe my father's memory some kind of debt? That is part of it, Kale admitted without hesitation. I will not lie to you about that. But the mate bond does not form because of guilt, Elena. It does not recognize duty or obligation or strategic advantage. It simply is. I did not choose to feel it. I can only choose how to respond to it. And how do you choose to respond? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood. I choose to tell you the truth, KL said slowly. All of it, even the parts that make me look weak or foolish. I choose to give you the information you need to make your own decisions about what this bond means and whether you want to accept it. And I choose to protect you, whether you accept me or not, because that is what I should have been doing for the last 16 years. Elena felt the walls she had built around her heart beginning to crack. She wanted to hate him for his guilt-driven interest. She wanted to reject the mate bond as nothing more than biological manipulation. She wanted to maintain the careful distance that had kept her safe since her father's death. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw honesty there, she found she could not summon the necessary coldness. I need time, she said finally. Time to understand what this means. Time to decide if I can trust you. You will have it, Kale promised. As much time as you need. They reached the palace 3 days later. Elena had spent those days in a state of suspended emotion, trying to process everything she had learned while maintaining the careful distance that felt necessary for her survival. Kale had respected her boundaries, giving her space while remaining present, answering her questions honestly when she asked them, revealing nothing of the bond to his soldiers beyond a general interest in the welfare of a citizen. But nothing could have prepared her for the palace itself. It rose from the landscape like something out of legend, all soaring towers and gleaming stone and windows that caught the sunlight and scattered it like diamonds. The walls were ancient, built during the first age of wolf civilization, but they had been maintained and expanded over centuries until the structure seemed to exist outside of time itself. Guards in ceremonial armor flanked the massive gates. Servants rushed to attend the returning king. And every eye turned to Elena with barely concealed curiosity, wondering who this unknown Omega was and why she traveled in the royal carriage. Kale helped her down from the carriage himself, his hand warm and steady against hers. She should have pulled away. She should have maintained the distance that propriety demanded between a king and a commoner. She did not. Welcome to your new home, Keiko said quietly, his words meant for her ears alone. If you choose to make it so. Before Elena could respond, a figure emerged from the palace doors that made her blood run cold. He was tall and lean, with silver hair swept back from a face that might have been handsome if not for the calculating coldness in his eyes. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every step measured, every gesture precise. The wolves around him seemed to shrink back unconsciously, as if his very presence created a zone of discomfort. But it was not his bearing or his appearance that froze Elena in her tracks. It was the servant who walked 3 steps behind him, a male in simple robes with his hood drawn up against the afternoon sun. A male with red eyes that caught the light like burning embers. Elena knew those eyes. She had seen them once before, on the worst night of her life, watching from the shadows as Declan Frost destroyed her world. Your Majesty. The silver-haired male bowed with perfect courtesy that somehow managed to convey contempt. We did not expect you back so soon. The negotiations with the Eastern delegation have been progressing smoothly in your absence. Lord Aldrich Thorne, Cale replied, and Elena heard the subtle tension in his voice. I am sure they have. Allow me to introduce Elena Ashford, who will be staying at the palace as my guest. Thorne's eyes slid to Elena, assessing her with the same calculation a wolf might use to evaluate prey. Ashford, he repeated thoughtfully, an unusual name. I do not believe I am familiar with the family. Her father was Captain Marcus Ashford, Cale said, of my personal guard. Something flickered across Thorne's face. Surprise, perhaps, or something darker. Ah, the hero of the mountain pass. His tone made the word hero sound like an insult. How fortunate that his daughter has found her way into your care, Your Majesty. The coincidence is quite remarkable. Elena felt Cale tense beside her, felt the subtle shift in his power that suggested anger barely contained. See that quarters are prepared for Lady Elena in the West Wing, Cale said, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of command. And inform the kitchen that we will require a formal dinner this evening. I wish to introduce her to the court. Of course, Your Majesty, Thorne bowed again, that same mocking courtesy. I live to serve. He turned and swept back into the palace, his red-eyed servant following silently behind. Elena watched them go, her mind racing with questions she did not know how to ask. Who is he? She demanded as soon as they were out of earshot. Lord Aldrich Thorne, Cale answered grimly, ruler of the Eastern Territory. He is here to negotiate the renewal of the Blood Moon Treaty, which expires in 3 months. And the male with him, the one with the red eyes? Cale frowned. I do not know him. A servant, presumably? Why do you ask? Elena hesitated. The accusation she wanted to make seemed impossible, too coincidental to be believed. And yet she was certain, absolutely certain, that the male with red eyes was the same one who had watched Declan reject her. I have seen him before, she said carefully. At my rejection ceremony. He was watching from the shadows, and when Declan spoke the words that ended our betrothal, that male nodded, as if he had been waiting for it, as if it was exactly what he wanted. Cale's expression hardened into something dangerous. You are certain? I will never forget those eyes, Elena said. Never. The formal dinner that evening was an exercise in political theater that Elena barely survived. She sat at Cale's right hand, dressed in borrowed finery that felt like armor, trying to remember the correct way to hold her fork while wolves who had ruled territories for centuries evaluated her every move. Lord Thorne was present, of course. He sat across from her with that calculating smile, making conversation that seemed innocent on the surface but carried undercurrents of challenge and threat. 300 years, Thorne said during a lull in the broader conversation, his voice pitched to Carrie. That is how long His Majesty has ruled these territories. A remarkable achievement, but one must wonder whether such extended reign serves the kingdom or merely the king. Elena felt Cale tense beside her, but before he could respond, she heard herself speaking. I think the measure of a ruler is not the length of their reign, but the state of their people. A kingdom at peace, where wolves can raise families and pursue their lives without fear, suggests leadership that serves more than vanity. Thorne's eyes narrowed with surprise and something that might have been grudging respect. A philosophical answer from an Omega. How unexpected. Tell me, Lady Elena, do you believe power concentrated in one pair of hands for so long can truly be just? no matter how benevolent the ruler claims to be? I believe that justice is measured by how the powerful treat the powerless, Elena replied steadily, not by how long they have held their power. I have seen pacts where leadership changed every decade and cruelty remained constant. And I have lived under a king who has maintained peace for 50 years. The numbers mean less than the reality. Thorne smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. A clever response. Perhaps you are more than a simple Omega after all. The dinner continued, but Elena could not shake the feeling that she had just passed some kind of test. Or perhaps failed one. Thorne watched her throughout the rest of the meal with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and his red-eyed servant stood in the shadows near the door, those ember eyes fixed on her with an attention that felt like being marked for death. That night, Elena could not sleep. She paced her borrowed chambers, her mind churning through everything she had observed. The red-eyed servant. Thorne's pointed questions about Kael's lengthy reign. The Blood Moon Treaty that was set to expire. And slowly, piece by piece, a terrible picture began to form. She found Commander Silas in the training yard the next morning, overseeing the drills of the palace guard. He looked up at her approach, and something in his expression suggested he had been expecting her. You have questions, he said, about Lord Thorne. I have suspicions, Elena corrected, about the male who serves him, the one with red eyes. Silas gestured for her to walk with him, leading her away from the guards to a quiet corner of the yard. What do you suspect? That he was present at my rejection ceremony, Elena said. That Declan's refusal was not his own choice. That someone forced him to reject me, and that someone may have been connected to Thorne. Silas was silent for a long moment. The Blood Moon Treaty, he said finally. Do you know its terms? Only that it established peace with the Eastern Territory 50 years ago. There is more. Silas' voice dropped lower. The treaty included a succession clause. If Kael produces no heir within 50 years of signing, the Eastern Territory gains the right to nominate candidates for the throne. Thorne has been positioning himself for decades, placing allies in key positions, building support among the lesser lords. And if Kael found a mate, Elena asked slowly, if he produced an heir, the clause becomes void, the succession remains secure, and Thorne's 50 years of planning become worthless. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her. He has been preventing Kael from finding a mate, she whispered. That is why his servant was at my ceremony. That is why Declan rejected me. Thorne has been sabotaging any potential bond before it could form. We have suspected as much for years, Silas admitted. But we have never had proof. Never had a witness who could connect Thorne's agents to specific incidents. Elena's hands clenched at her sides. She thought of Declan's pale face, his trembling hands, the fear she had seen in his eyes. She thought of 16 years of believing herself worthless, of struggling alone, of building walls around her heart to survive. All of it because of Thorne's ambition. I can give you that witness, she said, her voice hard with determination. But we need more than my word against a territorial lord. We need proof that cannot be denied. What do you suggest? Elena took a deep breath, feeling the plan crystallize in her mind with the same clarity her father's tactical lessons had always brought. We let him think he has won. The strategy was simple in concept, but required precise execution. Elena would pretend that her connection to Kael was weakening, that she was considering leaving the palace, that the mate bond was not as strong as it seemed. The rumors would spread, as rumors always did in courts full of ambitious wolves seeking advantage. And Thorne, believing his victory was within reach, would move to ensure she never returned. When he did, they would be waiting. Kael resisted the plan initially. The thought of using Elena as bait, of putting her in danger to expose Thorne's treachery, went against every protective instinct he possessed. I will not risk you, he said flatly during their private meeting in his study. There must be another way. There is no other way, Elena countered. Not one that gives us proof before the treaty expires. Thorne has been too careful for too long. He will not expose himself unless he believes he has already won. And if something goes wrong, if his agents decide that eliminating you is simpler than bribing you to leave, then I will fight. Elena met his eyes without flinching. My father taught me to defend myself, remember? I am not as helpless as Thorne believes. Kale shook his head, but Elena could see his resolve weakening. It was Silas who tipped the balance. She has the right to choose this, the old commander said quietly. Her father chose to fight for what he believed in, even knowing the cost. Will you deny his daughter the same choice? The words struck home. Elena saw Kale's expression shift, saw him recognize the parallel between her determination and her father's sacrifice. If we do this, Kale said finally, we do it with every precaution. Guards hidden along every route. Signals established for the first sign of danger. And the moment we have enough evidence, we end it. Agreed, Elena said. 3 days later, she walked out of the palace gates alone. The rumors had done their work. The court whispered about the Omega who could not hold the king's interest, about the mate bond that had proven false, about the peasant girl who was finally being sent away in disgrace. Thorne's spies would have reported every word. Elena made her way through the city streets as evening fell, following a route that would take her toward the eastern road. She walked with the defeated posture of a wolf who had lost everything, her head down, her shoulders slumped, every line of her body projecting the despair that Thorne's agents would expect to see. She was nearly at the city gates when they found her. 3 males emerged from an alley, blocking her path. The one in the lead was the red-eyed servant, his hood pushed back to reveal a face marked with ritual scars. Lady Elena, his voice was soft, almost gentle. Lord Thorne sends his regards. He wishes to offer you an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? Elena kept her voice trembling, afraid exactly what they would expect from a rejected Omega cornered in a dark street. A chance to start over. The red-eyed male produced a pouch that clinked with coin. Gold enough to establish yourself anywhere you wish. All Lord Thorne asks in return is that you leave the Northern Territories and never return. That you forget you ever met the king. Elena pretended to consider the offer, her eyes darting between the 3 males as if calculating her chances of escape. And if I refuse? The gentle mask slipped, revealing the predator beneath. Then we will be forced to ensure your departure by other means. Less pleasant means. Lord Thorne is not a patient wolf, Lady Elena. He has waited 50 years for this opportunity. He will not allow a common Omega to destroy it. Elena straightened her spine, letting the fear drain from her posture. Then I suppose you should know something, she said clearly. I am not common, and I am not alone. The signal had been given. Armed guards poured from hidden positions along the street, surrounding Thorne's agents before they could react. Silas himself emerged from the shadows, his sword drawn, his eyes cold with the promise of violence. The red-eyed male's face twisted with fury as he realized the trap. This changes nothing, he snarled. You have no proof that Lord Thorne sent us. It will be your word against a territorial lord. Actually, Elena said, gesturing to the rooftop where a scribe had been positioned to witness and record everything, we have considerably more than my word. The agents were taken into custody, their threats and bribes documented in full. By morning, the evidence would be presented to the Council of Lords. By afternoon, Thorne's carefully constructed plans would begin to crumble. But as Elena walked back to the palace, surrounded by guards, a terrible thought struck her. Thorne had spent 50 years planning for this. He would have contingencies, backup plans, moves that they had not anticipated. What if the agents had been a distraction? She broke into a run, pushing past the startled guards, her heart pounding with sudden certainty that something was terribly wrong. The palace gates loomed ahead of her. Servants scattered as she burst through the entrance. She took the stairs 3 at a time, racing toward the royal chambers. She found Kale collapsed on the floor of his study, his face ashen, his breathing shallow, his body convulsing with tremors that spoke of poison working its way through his system. And she knew with the same instinct that had recognized wolfsbane in a dying patient months ago exactly what had been done to him. The water, she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. Thorne poisoned the water supply. Wolfsbane diluted to work slowly, to weaken without killing outright. Kale's hand found hers, his grip weak but desperate. Elena. Her name was barely a whisper on his lips. Save your strength, she commanded, already calculating dosages and treatment protocols, already planning how to save the wolf who had become everything to her. You will not die on me, Kale Ironwood. Not after everything we have survived to find each other. Not when I have finally found where I belong. She had work to do, and she would not fail. Elena had seen wolves die from wolfsbane poisoning before. During her months of wandering, she had encountered the aftermath of territorial disputes and bandit attacks, had knelt beside wolves whose only hope was a traveling healer who happened to know the antidote. She had watched strong males reduced to convulsing wrecks, their bodies betraying them as the toxin worked its way through their blood. She had held the hands of warriors as the light faded from their eyes, their lungs slowly filling with fluid, their hearts stuttering and failing. She remembered one wolf in particular, an old male she had found on the road 3 months into her exile. He had been poisoned by rivals, left to die slowly in a ditch, while his attackers fled with his possessions. Elena had recognized the symptoms immediately and spent hours fighting to save him. She had succeeded, and the grateful wolf had given her a silver ring as payment, telling her it would bring her luck someday. She still wore that ring, and now, looking down at Kael's ashen face, she drew strength from the memory of that victory. She would not let that happen to Kael, not to her mate, not to the wolf her father had died to protect. Her hands moved with the precision her father had drilled into her, checking pulse points, assessing pupil dilation, calculating the progression of symptoms. The poison was in its early stages. The tremors indicated the toxin had not yet reached critical concentration in his bloodstream. There was still time, but only if she acted fast. "Guards," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos with an authority she had not known she possessed. "I need every healer in the palace summoned to the Great Hall immediately. Send runners to the kitchens to seal all water supplies. No one drinks anything until I say otherwise. And bring me the royal herbalist stores. All of them." The guards hesitated, looking at each other with uncertainty. She was an Omega, a guest, a commoner who had no right to give orders in the royal palace. Now, Elena put every ounce of her father's battlefield command into the word. "Your king is dying. Move." They moved. Elena turned back to Kael, cradling his head in her lap as another wave of tremors shook his body. His skin was clammy, his breathing shallow, his eyes glazed with pain he was fighting not to show. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Do you hear me? You have survived 300 years. You have outlived wars and betrayals and enemies beyond counting. You will not die from a coward's poison in your own home." Kael's hand found hers, his grip weak but determined. Elena. Her name was a rasp of sound. The treaty. "If I die before it expires, Thorn wins. You are not going to die." Elena squeezed his hand hard enough to hurt, hard enough to anchor him to the present moment. "I did not survive rejection and roguehood and 3 days of heat calling your name just to watch you die now. Do you understand me? You are going to live because I am going to save you. And then you are going to owe me a very large debt." A ghost of a smile flickered across Kael's pain-twisted face. "Bossy Omega. Dying king. Now stop talking and conserve your strength." The next hours blurred together into a nightmare of calculation and desperation. Elena commandeered the Great Hall, transforming it into a field hospital as more and more palace residents began showing symptoms. The wolfsbane had been in the water supply for at least a day, she determined. Everyone who had drunk from the palace wells was affected. Guards, servants, nobles, healers. Over 200 wolves poisoned by a single act of treachery. The scale of the disaster would have overwhelmed anyone without Elena's particular combination of knowledge and determination. She moved through the makeshift hospital like a force of nature, assessing symptoms, calculating dosages, directing treatments with the precision of a military commander orchestrating a campaign. Thorn had planned this well. Even if Elena could save Kael, the palace would be crippled. The guards too weak to fight. The healers too sick to heal. The kingdom's leadership decimated by poison, while its greatest enemy sat untouched in guest quarters, drinking only the wine he had brought from his own territory. He had planned for every contingency. He had considered every angle. He had spent 50 years preparing for this moment of triumph. But Thorn had not planned on Elena. He had not anticipated that a rejected Omega would possess the knowledge to recognize his poison. He had not imagined that the daughter of a dead captain would have the skills to counteract his careful sabotage. He had dismissed her as irrelevant, as a minor obstacle to be removed, and that dismissal would be his undoing. She organized the palace healers into teams, assigning the least affected to treat those in worse condition. She directed servants to bring charcoal from the smithy, grinding it fine and mixing it with water to absorb the toxin in affected stomachs. She prepared batch after batch of the antidote her father had taught her, the precise combination of herbs that could neutralize wolfsbane if administered early enough. Prioritize the guards first, she ordered General Mira Blackwood, who had been among the first to receive treatment and was already recovering. If Thorn decides to attack while we are to weaken, they are our only defense. Mira looked at her with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something approaching respect. You think like a soldier. I am the daughter of one. Elena did not pause in her work, her hands steady even as exhaustion pulled at her bones. My father taught me that the first priority in any crisis is securing the perimeter. Everything else comes after. Your father would be proud. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She blinked back the sudden moisture in her eyes and kept working. By dawn, the worst of the crisis had passed. The guards were recovering. The servants were stable. The nobles who had been poisoned were weak but alive. And Kael, who had received the highest concentration of toxin through the private water supply in his chambers, had finally stopped convulsing. Elena sat beside his bed, watching his chest rise and fall with increasingly steady breaths. She had not slept in over 20 hours. Her hands were stained with herbs and medicine. Her borrowed court dress was ruined beyond repair. And she had never felt more like herself. This was what her father had prepared her for. Not needlework or housekeeping or pleasing a mate. This, saving lives when everything seemed lost. Making the impossible possible through knowledge and determination and the refusal to accept defeat. You saved them. Kael's voice was weak but clear. Elena looked down to find his gray eyes open, focused on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. I saved us, she corrected softly. All of us, although you were particularly stubborn about it. Kael reached up to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek with a tenderness that seemed impossible from a wolf who had ruled through 3 centuries of conflict. My mate, the words carried the weight of absolute certainty. My brave, brilliant, impossible mate, I do not deserve you. Perhaps not. Elena allowed herself a small smile, but you are stuck with me nonetheless. The confrontation came 3 days later. Kael had recovered enough to stand, to walk, to reclaim his throne with the support of Elena at his side and Silas at his back. The Council of Lords had been summoned. The evidence against Thorn had been compiled, and the red-eyed servant had broken under interrogation, revealing a conspiracy that stretched back 50 years. Lord Aldrich Thorn stood before the assembled council with the bearing of a wolf who still believed himself untouchable. His silver hair gleamed in the torchlight. His cold eyes swept the gathered lords with undisguised contempt. Even now, even with his agents captured and his plots exposed, he showed no fear. These accusations are absurd, he declared, his voice ringing through the great hall with practiced authority. The word of a common Omega and a tortured servant against a territorial lord. Against a wolf who has served this kingdom faithfully for centuries? This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to invalidate the Blood Moon Treaty before its terms can be fulfilled. Kael rose from his throne, and the hall fell silent. He did not look like a wolf who had nearly died 3 days ago. He looked like the Alpha King who had united the territories through force of will and strength of arm. He looked like the warrior who had survived ambushes and assassination attempts and enemies beyond counting. He looked like exactly what he was, the most dangerous wolf in the room. You speak of service, Kael said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. Let us speak of service, then. Let us speak of the agents you sent to packs across the territories, threatening and bribing intended mates away from any Omega who might catch my attention. Let us speak of the ceremony you sabotaged 16 years ago, when your servant threatened the family of Declan Frost unless he rejected the Omega he had courted for 2 years. Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room turned toward her. She stood tall, refusing to show the churning emotions beneath her surface calm. Kael continued, his voice growing harder with each word. Let us speak of the poison you introduced into my water supply. The poison that nearly killed me and over 200 members of my household. The poison that would have left the Northern Territories leaderless and vulnerable, exactly as you planned. Thorne's composure finally cracked. A flicker of rage crossed his features before he suppressed it. You have no proof of any of this. We have your agent's full confession. Kyle gestured, and guards brought forward the red-eyed servant, his wrists bound, his face bearing the marks of interrogation. We have records of payments made to wolves across the territories, payments that coincide with the rejection of potential mates. We have the testimony of Lady Elena herself, who witnessed your agent at her rejection ceremony. A confession obtained through torture, Thorne spat. Records that could have been fabricated. The word of an Omega with every reason to lie. This is not justice. This is persecution. Then let us add one more piece of evidence. The voice came from the back of the hall. The crowd parted to reveal a figure Elena had not expected to see. Declan Frost walked forward with the slow, deliberate steps of a wolf who had come to face his own judgment. He looked older than Elena remembered, lines of strain etched around his eyes and mouth. He looked like a wolf who had not slept well in a very long time. I was there, Declan said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I know what Thorne did because he did it to me. Elena felt the world narrow to this moment, to this male who had shattered her life standing before the council with truth finally on his lips. 3 days before my mating ceremony, Declan continued, a servant with red eyes came to my family's home. He told me that Lord Thorne had taken an interest in the Omega I intended to bond. He told me that if I proceeded with the ceremony, my family would suffer accidents. My father's business would fail. My sister would vanish. He told me that Lord Thorne had done this before and would not hesitate to do it again. Declan's voice broke and Elena saw tears glistening in his eyes. I was a coward. I should have fought. I should have found another way. Instead, I stood before the woman I cared for and destroyed her in front of everyone she knew. I have lived with that shame every day since. And I have come here now to tell the truth, whatever the consequences may be. The hall erupted into chaos. Lords shouted accusations and denials. Guards moved to secure the exits. Thorne's face had gone white with fury, his careful mask finally shattered beyond repair. But Elena barely noticed any of it. She was looking at Declan, at the male who had broken her heart and carried the weight of that breaking ever since. She had hated him for so long, had built her identity around the rejection he had inflicted, had told herself that his cruelty proved her worthlessness. And now she knew the truth. He had been a victim too, a pawn in a game neither of them had known they were playing. Enough! Cale's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. The hall fell silent instantly, every wolf responding to the undeniable authority of their king. Lord Aldrich Thorne, you are charged with conspiracy against the crown, attempted assassination of the king, and the systematic manipulation of mating bonds across the territories. The evidence against you is overwhelming. The testimony against you is damning. How do you answer these charges? Thorne straightened his spine, and for a moment, something almost like dignity flickered in his cold eyes. I answer that I did what I believed was necessary. 300 years, Ironwood. 300 years you have held power while the rest of us watched and waited and wondered when it would end. You speak of service, but you have served only yourself. You have clung to your throne through century after century while the kingdom stagnated beneath your eternal rule. His voice rose, taking on the fervor of true belief. I gave 50 years of my life to this plan. 50 years of patience and preparation, waiting for the treaty I negotiated to finally bear fruit. And I would do it again. The territories need change. They need new blood. They need a ruler who will not live forever, accumulating power until no one can challenge them. Then you confess, Kale said flatly. I confess to nothing except loving my people more than you ever have. The silence that followed was absolute. Kale descended from his throne, crossing the hall until he stood face to face with Thorne. The two wolves were of a height, but Kale seemed larger somehow, his presence filling the space between them with the weight of centuries. You believe I have ruled too long, Kale said quietly. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps 300 years is too much power for any one wolf to hold. But your methods, Thorne. The lives you destroyed. the families you threatened, the poison you used against innocents who had done you no harm. Those are not the actions of a patriot. Those are the actions of a tyrant in waiting." He turned away, addressing the assembled lords. "Lord Aldrich Thorne is stripped of his title and territories. He will be confined to the eastern marches for the remainder of his days, under guard and without authority. His co-conspirators will face similar justice, and the Blood Moon Treaty is hereby declared void, its terms violated by the very wolf who negotiated them." Thorne lunged. It happened so fast that Elena barely registered the movement. One moment, Thorne was standing in defeat. The next, he had produced a hidden blade and was driving it toward Kael's unprotected back. Elena moved without thinking. She had been standing close to the throne, close enough to intercept. Her body responded to her father's training before her mind could catch up, throwing herself between Thorne and Kael, her hand catching Thorne's wrist and redirecting the blade away from vital organs. The knife cut a burning line across her ribs instead of burying itself in Kael's heart. Elena and Thorne crashed to the floor together. Guards swarmed over them, dragging Thorne away as he screamed obscenities and threats. Elena lay on the cold stone, looking up at the vaulted ceiling, feeling warmth spreading across her side where the blade had found flesh. "Elena." Kael's face appeared above her, his expression wild with fear and fury and something else, something that looked like the shattering of a carefully maintained facade. "Elena, stay with me, stay with me. Stay with me." She wanted to tell him she was fine. The wound was shallow, more painful than dangerous. But the words would not come. The shock of impact was catching up with her, and darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness claimed her was Kael's voice, raw with emotion he had hidden for 3 centuries. "Do not leave me, please, I cannot lose you too." Elena woke to sunlight and the smell of healing herbs. She was in a bed softer than anything she had ever known, surrounded by pillows and blankets that seemed designed to cocoon her in comfort. Bandages wrapped her torso, professionally applied and already working to knit the wound beneath. And sitting beside her bed, his gray eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been frightening, was Kael Ironwood. "How long?" Elena's voice came out as a croak. 3 days. Kael leaned forward, his hand finding hers and gripping it as if she might disappear. "You have been sleeping while your body healed. The palace healers said the wound was clean and would leave only a small scar." "Only a small scar." Elena laughed weakly. "My first battle wound. My father would be proud. Your father would be furious that you risked yourself." Kael's voice was rough with emotion. "As am I. What were you thinking, throwing yourself between an assassin and your king?" "I was thinking that after everything we have endured, after all the trials that brought us together, I refuse to let a coward's blade steal you from me." Elena squeezed his hand. "I was thinking that my father gave his life to save yours, and I was not about to let his sacrifice be wasted. I was thinking that you are my mate, and I would rather bleed than watch you fall." Kael stared at her for a long moment. Then, with a sound that might have been a laugh or a sorrow, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. "You impossible woman. You brave, stubborn, impossible woman. I have lived for 300 years, and I have never known anyone like you." "Good," Elena smiled against his skin. "Then you will not grow bored." They stayed that way for a long time, breathing together, existing in a bubble of peace that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Elena felt the mate bond humming between them, stronger than ever, strengthened by shared crisis and mutual sacrifice. Finally, Kael pulled back. "There is someone who wishes to speak with you." He hesitated. "If you are willing." Elena knew who he meant before he said the name. Declan came to her bedside with the air of a man approaching his own execution. He knelt beside her bed, his head bowed, his hands clasped in his lap. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said quietly. "I know that what I did was unforgivable. But I needed you to know, needed you to understand, that I never wanted to hurt you. That day, that moment when I spoke those words, it was the worst day of my life. I have regretted it every moment since." Elena looked at him, at this male who had been such a central figure in her pain for so long. She had imagined this conversation 1,000 times during her months of wandering, had rehearsed the cutting words she would say, the cold dismissal she would deliver, the satisfaction she would feel watching him grovel for forgiveness she would never grant. But sitting here now, knowing the truth of what had been done to them both, she felt none of that. They threatened your family, she said softly. My father, my mother, my sister. Declan's voice cracked. They said they would make it look like accidents. They said no one would ever be able to prove anything. And I believed them because I had seen what happened to others who defied Thorne's schemes. Mating ceremonies that fell apart. Families that suffered mysterious misfortunes. Wolves who simply disappeared. He looked up, and Elena saw the depth of his anguish in his eyes. I told myself I was protecting you too. That if we bonded, you would become a target as well. That Thorne would never stop until he had destroyed both of us. I told myself that hurting you once was better than watching you suffer forever. It was not your choice to make, Elena said. I know that now. I knew it then, but I was young and afraid, and I did not have the courage to fight. So I did the cowardly thing, and I have paid for it every day since. Elena reached out and took his hand. Declan flinched at the contact as if expecting her to strike him. I forgive you. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. What? Declan's voice was barely a whisper. I forgive you, Elena repeated. You were as much a victim as I was. Thorne used us both as pieces in his game. Hating you will not change what happened. It will only continue to poison my life the way his wolfsbane poisoned the palace. She squeezed his hand gently. But I also thank you. Thank me? Declan looked at her with complete incomprehension. For what? For rejecting me. Elena smiled softly. Because if you had not, I would have bonded with you. I would have lived my life in Wintervale Pack, content enough, but never truly fulfilled. I would never have become a rogue. I would never have learned what I was capable of. And I would never have found him. She looked toward Kaio, who stood by the window watching them with an expression of fierce pride. My mate, Elena continued. My true mate. The other half of my soul. I found him because you rejected me. I found my purpose because you sent me wandering. The worst day of my life led me to the best thing that has ever happened to me. Declan stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly tears began to stream down his face. I do not deserve your forgiveness. Perhaps not, but I give it anyway. Now go, Declan Frost. Go and live your life. Find your own happiness. And know that the Omega you rejected has found hers. He rose unsteadily, bowing to her and then to Kaio, and made his way to the door. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. You were always too good for me, Elena Ashford. I see that now. I hope your king knows how fortunate he is. He does, Kaio said quietly. Believe me, he does. Declan left, and Elena felt something release in her chest. A weight she had carried for 3 years finally lifted. A wound she had nursed and protected, finally allowed to heal. It was over, all of it. The rejection, the pain, the years of believing herself worthless. It was finally, truly over. Kaio crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, his hand finding hers again, as if he could not bear to be apart from her. That was gracious of you, he said. More gracious than most would have been. Holding on to anger would only have hurt me. Elena turned her hand in his, interlacing their fingers. My father taught me that grudges are like carrying hot coals. The only one who gets burned is the one doing the carrying. Your father was a wise man. He was... Elena felt tears prick her eyes. I wish you could have met him. Really met him, I mean. Not as a soldier serving his king, but as the man who raised me. I feel as though I have... Kaio brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. In you, Elena. In your strength and your wisdom and your courage. Marcus Ashford lives on in you, and through you, I have come to know him better than I ever did in our 2 centuries of service together. The tears spilled over, and Elena did not try to stop them. These were not tears of grief or pain. These were tears of healing, of release, of finally allowing herself to feel all the things she had locked away for so long. I love you, she whispered. I know it has only been weeks. I know it seems impossible, but I love you, Kaio Ironwood. Not because of the mate bond, not because you saved me. I love you because of who you are, because of the man I see behind the crown, because you could have taken me that night in the cabin, and instead you waited, because you gave me the choice that no one else ever has. Kale's eyes glistened with moisture of his own. I have waited 300 years to hear those words. I had given up hope that I ever would. And now, hearing them from you, I understand something I never did before. What is that? Why I survived. Kale's voice was rough with emotion. Every battle, every betrayal, every loss, every year of loneliness. I survived it all so that I could be here in this moment with you. You are not just my mate, Elena. You are my purpose, the reason for all of it. The answer to prayers I forgot I was praying. He leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promises neither of them needed to speak aloud. The mate bond blazed between them, golden and warm, wrapping around them both in an embrace that felt like coming home. When they finally parted, Elena was smiling through her tears. I suppose this means I have to become a queen. If you will have the position. It seems like a lot of work. I will help you. We will help each other. Elena pretended to consider this, enjoying the flash of uncertainty in Carol's eyes. Very well, she said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. First, I want to establish a training program for Omegas. Self-defense, herbal medicine, basic tactics. No Omega should have to survive what I survived without the tools to protect themselves. Done. Second, I want a formal review of all mating rejection cases from the past 50 years. If Thorne sabotaged others the way he sabotaged me, those wolves deserve to know the truth. Done. Third, Elena paused, a mischievous smile playing at her lips. I want a garden. A proper medicinal garden where I can grow the herbs I need to continue my healing work. Being queen does not mean I intend to stop being useful. Kale laughed, the sound warm and genuine, in a way that transformed his ancient face into something almost boyish. Done, done, and done. Anything else? Just one more thing. Name it. Kiss me again. He obliged. The mating ceremony was held on the first full moon after Elena's recovery. The great hall had been transformed into something out of legend, draped in silver and blue, lit by 1,000 candles that cast dancing shadows across ancient stone. Representatives from every pack in the territories had gathered to witness what many were already calling the most significant royal event in centuries. Elena stood at the entrance to the hall, dressed in a gown of deep blue silk that matched the royal standard. Her dark hair had been woven with silver threads that caught the candlelight. The small scar on her ribs, hidden beneath the fabric, served as a private reminder of how far she had come. General Mira Blackwood stood beside her, serving as her honor guard for the ceremony. The older female had become something like a mentor in the weeks since the crisis, teaching Elena the protocols and politics she would need to navigate as queen. You have come a long way, Omega, Mira said quietly. From the kitchens of a way station to the queen's chambers. It is a journey worthy of legend. I have had help. Elena looked at her steadily, including yours. You earned it, every step. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. The door swung open, and Elena stepped forward into her future. The walk down the central aisle felt endless and instantaneous all at once. She was aware of the eyes upon her, the whispers, the weight of judgment from wolves who had ruled territories for centuries. She was aware of her own heartbeat, steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But most of all, she was aware of Cahill. He stood at the far end of the hall before the ancient throne that had supported the weight of countless kings. He wore ceremonial armor that gleamed in the candlelight, a sword at his hip, a crown upon his head. He looked every inch the Alpha King, the ruler who had shaped a kingdom through 3 centuries of trial and triumph. But his eyes, those storm gray eyes that had first captured her at the way station, held nothing of kingship. They held only love, only wonder, only the profound gratitude of a wolf who had finally found what he had been searching for across the long, lonely years. Elena reached him, and he took her hands in his. Brothers and sisters, Cale's voice rang out across the hall. Wolves of the Northern Territories. We are gathered to witness the completion of a bond that was written in the stars before either of us drew breath. A true mate bond, forming between your king and the woman who stands before you. He turned to face Elena fully, his grip tightening on her hands. Elena Ashford, daughter of Captain Marcus Ashford, hero of the mountain pass, healer of the wounded, savior of the poisoned, warrior in your own right who stood between your king and an assassin's blade without hesitation. His voice softened, became something intimate despite the hundreds of witnesses. You came to me rejected and alone, believing yourself worthless. But I saw your worth from the first moment. I saw the strength you tried to hide. I saw the fire you kept banked beneath your submission. I saw the woman you were meant to become, and I have watched with pride as you became her. Elena felt tears threatening again, but she held them back. This moment deserved her full presence, not the blur of weeping. I offer you my crown, Kale continued. My kingdom, my protection, my heart. All that I am and all that I have, I lay at your feet. Will you accept me, Elena? Will you be my mate, my queen, my partner in all things? The hall held its collective breath. Elena looked into his eyes and she saw everything. The centuries of loneliness. The weight of command. The losses that had shaped him. The hope that had somehow survived it all. She saw the man behind the king, vulnerable and strong in equal measure, offering himself to her without reservation. I accept, she said, her voice clear and strong, despite the tears now streaming down her face. I accept you, Cale Ironwood, not for your crown or your kingdom or your protection. I accept you for your heart, for the wolf who waited when he could have taken, for the king who gave me choices when everyone else took them away, for the mate my soul recognized before my mind could catch up. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. I offer you my knowledge, she continued, my healing hands, my determination, my father's legacy, and my own courage. I offer you a partner who will stand beside you in darkness and light, who will challenge you when you are wrong and support you when you are right, who will love you not as a subject loves a king, but as an equal loves an equal. Kale's composure finally broke. A single tear traced down his scarred cheek. Then let it be witnessed, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Before all gathered here, I claim Elena Ashford as my mate and my queen. Let the bond be recognized. Let the union be celebrated. Let none challenge what the fates themselves have joined. He produced a delicate crown of silver and sapphires. The queen's crown that had not been worn in over 2 centuries. With hands that trembled slightly, he placed it upon Elena's head. The weight of it settled on her brow, cool and solid and real. She was a queen now. The rejected Omega who had washed dishes for coin was now the most powerful female in the Northern Territories. The hall erupted in cheers and applause. Wolves howled their approval. The sound washed over Elena like a wave, overwhelming and exhilarating all at once. But she barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on KO, on the bond blazing between them like a sun, on the promise of the future they would build together. He kissed her then in front of everyone, a claiming and a promise and a celebration all in one. The bond completed itself in that moment, snapping into place with an almost audible click, binding them together in ways that went beyond physical touch or spoken vows. They were one now, they would be one forever. That night, after the ceremony and the feast and the endless congratulations, Elena stood on a balcony overlooking the moonlit kingdom. Kale stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had given her, about the sacrifice he had made. She thought about the 8-year-old girl who had sat in a military tent learning about wolfsbane, not knowing that knowledge would one day save a kingdom. She thought about the rejected Omega who had walked away from everything she knew, believing herself worthless, not knowing that her worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. What are you thinking about? Kale asked softly. My father, Elena replied. He told me once that knowledge is the weapon no one can take from you. I did not understand then. I thought he was talking about herbs and tactics. And now I understand he was talking about something bigger. Knowledge of who you are. Knowledge of your own value. The understanding that your worth is not determined by whether someone chooses you or rejects you. She turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the moonlight. I spent 3 years believing I was worthless because Declan rejected me. I let one wolf's coerced words define my entire sense of self. But the truth is, I was always worthy. I just did not know it yet. Kale cupped her face in his hands. And now? Now I know. Elena smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had finally come home to herself. I am Elena Ironwood, daughter of a hero, maid of a king, queen of the Northern Territories, healer, warrior, survivor. And I am exactly who I was always meant to be. She leaned up and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. Thank you, she whispered against his lips. For what? For waiting, for choosing, for showing me what I was worth when I could not see it myself. Kale held her close, his heart beating steady against hers. I should be thanking you, he said, for saving me, in more ways than you know. They stood together on the balcony as the moon traced its path across the sky, and two wolves bound by fate and choice, and a love that had been centuries in the making. Below them, the kingdom slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that their king had finally found his queen. And somewhere in the realm beyond the stars, Elena liked to think her father was watching. He had told her once that he would always be with her, that even if she could not see him, he would be watching, and he would be proud. She believed him now. She finally, truly believed him. Because being soft was not weakness. Because being vulnerable was not failure. And because being rejected by the wrong wolf had led her, step by painful step, to the right one. She was Queen Elena Ironwood now, true mate to the Alpha King, healer of the wounded, survivor of the impossible. And she had never been more herself or more loved in all her life.